In 1941, Operation Barbarossa drives deep into Soviet territory, aiming to destroy the Red Army and capture Moscow before winter arrives. For Hitler and the German command, Moscow represents political control, logistical dominance, and the symbolic heart of Soviet resistance. Soviet forces, battered by months of retreat, struggle to rebuild defensive lines as manpower, equipment, and morale rapidly decline. In this alternate timeline, German supply lines hold, coordination improves, and the offensive momentum toward Moscow never truly slows. By September, artillery thunder echoes across Moscow's outskirts, as civilians flee and the reality of invasion reaches the capital itself. Soviet leadership faces an impossible decision, balancing symbolic defense with the urgent need to preserve state authority and command continuity. House by house, German troops push forward, turning Moscow's streets into deadly corridors of fire, rubble, and relentless close combat. The fall of the Kremlin marks an unprecedented shock, shattering the illusion of Soviet invincibility across the nation and the world. Moscow's occupation creates fear, confusion, and uncertainty, as citizens struggle to comprehend a reality once considered unimaginable. While Moscow falls, the Soviet government evacuates eastward, determined that the state will survive even if the capital does not. Trains carrying ministers, archives, and industrial planners race eastward, transforming distant cities into the new nerve centers of Soviet power. From improvised headquarters, Soviet leadership struggles to maintain control, communication, and authority across an empire suddenly fractured by defeat. German forces consolidate their victory, believing Moscow's capture may finally break Soviet resistance and force a negotiated collapse. Yet holding Moscow proves difficult, as German logistics strain under distance, weather, and constant partisan harassment. Across occupied territories, partisan warfare intensifies, draining German manpower and undermining any illusion of total control. Far from defeated, the Red Army regroups beyond Moscow, rebuilding shattered units and preparing for a long, punishing war of survival. Soviet industry, relocated east, resumes production, proving that territorial loss does not automatically mean economic collapse. German commanders face a dilemma: advance deeper into the Soviet interior or secure overstretched gains around Moscow. Winter arrives regardless of victory, freezing equipment, exhausting troops, and reminding Germany that Moscow was never the war's final test. Even without Moscow, the Soviet state endures, signaling that the conflict has entered a longer, deadlier, and more uncertain phase. The front stabilizes east of Moscow, where exhaustion, weather, and distance begin to erode the momentum of German victory. Soviet propaganda reframes Moscow's loss as temporary, urging unity, sacrifice, and revenge against an enemy occupying sacred ground. Occupation breeds resentment, as harsh policies and reprisals push civilians toward resistance rather than submission. In distant headquarters, Soviet commanders plan future counter-offensives, accepting time and space as weapons against Germany's strength. Allied capitals react with alarm, fearing that Moscow's fall could shift the entire balance of the global war. For Britain and the United States, Soviet survival becomes essential, accelerating plans for aid, coordination, and eventual counterattack. Lend-Lease support expands, keeping Soviet armies supplied despite the psychological blow of losing their historic capital. In Tokyo, leaders reassess strategy, tempted by Siberia yet cautious of provoking a still dangerous Soviet state. In Germany, Moscow's capture fuels hope, yet expectations rise dangerously beyond what the war can realistically deliver. The war in the east stretches onward, revealing that even Moscow's fall cannot end a conflict of such scale. Soviet forces adapt to prolonged war, training new divisions while learning from the shock and lessons of Moscow's loss. Germany attempts to integrate Moscow into its logistics network, but damaged infrastructure slows any hope of sustained expansion. Civilian mobilization intensifies, as factories operate relentlessly to replace losses and support a war now defined by endurance. Anti-partisan operations consume German resources, transforming victory into a constant struggle for control behind the front. Radio broadcasts reassure citizens that leadership endures, framing Moscow's fall as sacrifice rather than surrender. Within the German command, disagreements grow over priorities, exposing cracks beneath the surface of apparent success. New Soviet armored formations emerge, signaling that industrial recovery is translating into renewed military capability. Allied convoys risk brutal conditions, underscoring a growing commitment to prevent Soviet collapse at any cost. Occupying Moscow drains German forces, turning a symbolic triumph into a daily burden of security and supply. In the Urals, glowing factories embody Soviet resilience, proving that survival depends on depth, industry, and relentless determination. Casualty reports reveal staggering losses, yet Soviet leadership accepts them as the price of buying time and survival. Fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns increasingly limit German mobility, eroding the advantages gained by capturing Moscow. Waves of new recruits arrive, expanding the Red Army despite the symbolic loss of its historic capital. Nazi propaganda proclaims victory, masking the reality that the war's decisive end remains dangerously elusive. Improved communications help Soviet forces coordinate across vast distances, preserving unity despite territorial fragmentation. Partisan ambushes intensify, turning every road and railway into a potential battlefield for German occupiers. Allied planners view Moscow's fall not as an end, but as proof the Axis must be defeated through prolonged global war. Production accelerates, ensuring Soviet armies will eventually regain the material strength needed for counter-offensives. For German soldiers, the war transforms into a grim test of endurance, far removed from early visions of swift victory. Symbolically, Soviet authority reasserts itself in the east, reinforcing the message that defeat at Moscow was not defeat itself. Strategic reserves gather far from the front, signaling that Soviet leadership is preparing not just to survive, but eventually to strike back. As the front expands, German planners confront a battlefield growing larger, costlier, and far harder to control. Loss and grief spread across Soviet society, yet mourning transforms into resolve rather than acceptance of defeat. Armored spearheads lose effectiveness, as terrain, weather, and shortages blunt the weapons that once guaranteed rapid victory. Political officers reinforce discipline and ideology, framing endurance as a moral duty tied directly to national survival. German rear areas become increasingly vulnerable, forcing troops to guard supply lines instead of advancing the front. Allied intelligence concludes that Moscow's fall has not broken Soviet capacity, reshaping long-term strategic expectations. New defensive belts rise far inland, ensuring that any further German advance would demand enormous additional sacrifices. Letters home reveal fading confidence, as soldiers realize Moscow's capture did not deliver the promised end to war. Beyond Moscow, the Soviet Union's immense depth continues to absorb blows, preserving the possibility of ultimate recovery. Industrial output steadily increases, proving that relocation eastward preserved the Soviet war economy despite the loss of Moscow. German forces shift toward defense, acknowledging that holding ground now matters more than risky advances into the Soviet interior. Soviet planners quietly coordinate massive troop movements, laying foundations for future operations hidden beyond the enemy's reach. At home, German civilians feel the strain, as resources drain eastward and the promise of quick victory fades. Training intensifies for large-scale operations, reflecting confidence that time now favors Soviet recovery and eventual counterattack. Security measures tighten across occupied territories, revealing Germany's growing fear of rebellion behind its own lines. In the United States, massive production surges, ensuring the Allies can sustain a long war against Axis ambitions. Soviet intelligence penetrates occupied regions, mapping enemy weaknesses and preparing the ground for future offensives. Defensive lines harden, signaling Germany's transition from aggressive conquest toward costly, prolonged occupation warfare. The Soviet hinterland remains vast and resilient, reminding all sides that geography itself is a formidable weapon. Long-term planning replaces crisis management, showing that Soviet leadership believes survival has already been secured. Occupation duties dominate German efforts, draining manpower that once fueled rapid advances across the Eastern Front. Daily life adapts to permanent war footing, embedding resistance and endurance into the fabric of Soviet society. Strategic overstretch becomes undeniable, as captured territory demands more resources than Germany can sustainably provide. Coordinated training suggests that future Soviet operations will emphasize scale, firepower, and relentless pressure. Even in apparent victory, German troops sense the front growing more dangerous with every passing month. Allied coordination deepens, treating Soviet endurance as the cornerstone of eventual Axis defeat. Reconnaissance probes test German defenses, marking the quiet beginning of a shift toward future offensives. Fortifications multiply, yet morale slips, as soldiers recognize the war's momentum slipping from their grasp. Time, space, and endurance converge, hinting that Moscow's fall may have delayed defeat rather than prevented it. Massive artillery concentrations suggest that the Red Army is preparing to reclaim initiative through overwhelming firepower. German intelligence detects growing Soviet strength, challenging assumptions that Moscow's fall ensured strategic dominance. Renewed confidence spreads through Soviet ranks, as preparation replaces desperation across the eastern reaches of the front. News from the east grows grim, forcing German society to confront a war far longer than promised. Allied industrial might accelerates, ensuring that Axis resources will eventually be overwhelmed by sheer material power. Operational plans take shape, reflecting confidence that conditions for decisive counteroffensives are slowly maturing. Defensive preparations reveal anxiety, as German forces brace for a future they no longer fully control. The Soviet state endures, proving that even the loss of its capital cannot erase its capacity to fight. Occupied Moscow stands silent, a reminder that symbolic victories can conceal strategic failures beneath their surface. History suggests that Moscow's fall would not end the war, but instead transform it into an even more relentless struggle.
An iron tide rolling west.
Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into alternate history fascinating,